welcome back to Consistently Candid. I am back with Nathan Labenz. We last spoke maybe 10 months ago. I'm not sure. It's been a while, and a lot has happened since then. So I wanted to get your take on like the state of play and recap some of the biggest AI things that have happened in the last year or so. So maybe if you just tell me, since the last time we spoke, what have been your kind of biggest positive and negative updates, and are you feeling better or worse about AI than you were about 10 months ago?
Yeah, last time I gave the case for cautious optimism. That's how I kind of summarized it. Certainly a lot has gone on. If I try to zoom out and just abstract away from a lot of the details, I think one of the biggest developments has been the recent revelation that reinforcement learning on top of at least like sufficiently powerful base language models really works and is actually can be like a pretty simple setup that works like remarkably well, and certainly is like, I think, been proven, by a lot of different groups at this point, with like OpenAI sort of, giving like a existence proof that such a thing was possible. And then DeepSeek and Kimi out of China giving like specific implementation details showing how they did it. And then like lots of, just other academic groups and other groups kind of doing their own versions. It does seem that at least for like, a decent class of reasoning problems, your sort of, math problems canonically and programming challenge type things where there's easy to verify answers, at least in those domains, it seems like you can push a sufficiently strong base model quite far down this reasoning path without needing a super complicated setup, without needing like a ton of inference compute, and even, without even needing like a super specific formula, like multiple different recipes or, strategies for doing this all seem to be working. And I suspect that that's going to also translate to a lot of other things. So I think we're just kind of entering this era. How well it translates and how well it translates to things where there's not a, clear ground truth, or, where it's beauty's in the eye of the beholder, so to speak, is going to be interesting to watch. But I do think there are a lot of things that you can create a good enough metric for to give a pretty good reward signal to a model. And I expect that we're just going to see like a lot of that applied increasingly sort of in the wild. It's even the kind of thing that like communities can do without needing, huge compute resources to do it. And so I sort of suspect that in the like zoomed out history, this might appear to be like a critical threshold. Everybody was kind of scaling these base models. Then somebody figured out that you could also scale inference compute. And then it became clear that it's actually pretty easy to do that. And that a lot of different groups, organizations, companies, can do it without totally, having to go all in financially or break the bank. And then what's that going to produce? It seems to me that it's likely to produce a lot of kind of weird AIs, because reinforcement learning also famously gives rise to strange behavior. It gives rise to phenomena like reward hacking. If you don't get your reward signal just right, then you have the chance of, getting reward hacked. And it also just gives rise to like inscrutable behaviors. We have seen specifically DeepSeek reported that like they trained a model purely with reinforcement learning and it was acting super weird in its, chain of thought. I haven't observed that personally, actually. To be clear, I'm not sure quite how weird it was, but they reported language switching, and we have seen that from other models. I've also seen that from Grok 3 in the last couple weeks or last couple days. So, just how weird do they behave? How inscrutable do they become? And how much do they surprise us? It's always been reinforcement learning that has taken things into the superhuman level of performance, classically with like game playing type things, right? Like you could train a Go playing AI on human games of Go, and you'd probably kind of top out around the human level of Go playing. It was when they had them playing each other and just rewarding them for winning that all of a sudden, you have these systems kind of zoom past human level. So reinforcement learning, self-play, the weirdness that can come of that, and the potentially surprising and likely in many domains superhuman capabilities that we're going to see out of that paradigm seem like, the big story that, that might kind of prove to be like a notable hinge moment in history. That's probably my number one candidate from the last year.
Okay, so what this implies that it might just be pretty or a lot easier and a lot cheaper than we thought to train these like quite powerful general purpose models.
Yeah, and to shape them in post-training in, any direction that you can give a reliable reward signal for. Mm-hmm. I think a lot has been made, in terms of how cheap the base models are. I mean, they're extremely cheap if you just download an open source one off the internet. So, that phenomenon has continued, right? Like DeepSeek put their models out for all to download and use however they want. So it doesn't get any cheaper than that. I think it's been a little bit overstated, maybe moderately overstated in some corners, how cheap the DeepSeek model was. That's been like pretty well chewed on by the community at this point, and like the sort of $6 million model or whatever, that's even in their own accounting, that's just like just the inference or sorry, not inference, just the compute used for like the single training run, to create that model once they'd already done the experiments, not counting all the salaries, not counting the fixed cost investments, so on and so forth. So I think it's still safe to say that like it's not cheap to create a frontier base model, and probably only going to get still more expensive as people are the leaders. I would say would not say that we've like moved from one scaling paradigm to another, but rather that we're now stacking scaling paradigms on top of one another. So they're both going to do like bigger base models, more, at least higher compute base models, and this sort of post training. What I expect will probably happen more in the wild is not so much that people, although distributed training also is like another interesting candidate for sort of a big story in the macro view, because it's until now always been kind of thought that like, well, you've got to have these like giant data centers to do this compute. There's no other way to do it. You've got to have like super high interconnect, and without these sort of very specialized setups in very like concentrated physical locations, that you just couldn't do it. And I think that is also pretty well now changed by the developments in distributed training, where basically people have figured out ways to just dramatically reduce the bandwidth overhead that is required. Simple, like, why is this hard in the first place? You've got these giant models with these, billions of parameters. If you're running them in faraway places and you're doing the training and you're collecting the gradients, which is, the updates to the model at each training step, you also need to sync those gradients. And those gradients are as big as the model itself, because you have like, if you have, in the DeepSeek case, you have a 671 billion parameter model. The gradient itself, at least in like naive form, is also 671 billion numbers. It's the 671 billion changes you're going to make to the 671 billion parameters. So if you calculate some changes over here and some changes over there in these like, disconnected compute environments, then you have the question of like, well, how do I sync those up and combine them so I can make like one coherent update to my model? And that means you've got to like send, hundreds of gigabytes across, do this syncing, and then also redistribute, hundreds of gigabytes back, out to the places where you're running the compute. So that's been like thought to be really hard. And that's why we need this like, super high interconnect. And that's even why like export controls were at times focused on specifically this sort of connectivity piece. And the thinking at one point in time was like, well, we can let China have the raw compute. They can do the inference. That's okay. We're not trying to, stop their economy, but we just don't want them to like train these like super crazy, models and so maybe we can kind of have the best of both worlds, like allow them to use stuff, but not, train at the frontier. And now it seems like, basically people have got clever about that. There are, ways to sort of shortcut or stream. One of the latest publications out of Google was called Streaming DeLoco, which is like distributed location something training, whatever. I don't know what DeLoco exactly stands for, but basically they can now with a smarter approach than just like doing the update and having to wait for hundreds of gigabytes to travel. They can now like stream these updates in a smart way, which basically means both you can do the distributed training, and also that like all these chips that we sold to China in the last couple of years, even if they had these like reduced interconnect properties, yeah, that's probably still going to work just fine, for training, because they'll be able to, follow publications out of Google and use, of course, their own, engineering prowess, which is proven to be very substantial to like work their way around that. So it does still take a lot of compute to train a powerful base model. It's not the kind of thing that just like, hobbyists can do. It is the kind of thing now that a well-organized but distributed group could potentially patch together the resources to do. Probably not at like the real scale that the Western leaders are going to push as they go into hundreds of millions and, potentially billions for single training runs. But definitely still enough to like get to the place where they could, in theory, do a base model at like today's frontier in a distributed way. And, then just going back to the post-training behavior, like that stuff is like really quite cheap. And especially in these distributed paradigms, like really anyone, can kind of post-train in a reinforcement learning way. Anyone's maybe a little bit too permissive of a declaration there, but like you don't have to be a super well-resourced group to muster the kinds of compute that are used to do these post-training things. And that does, unlock a lot. Then at inference time, you have another question of like, okay, well, maybe you train this thing, but do you actually have the capability to use it, And that's another area where differently resourced actors have like very different propositions. Meta's talking about, I think, a $200 billion data center was the last thing that they floated. And we've got the Orion project that's $500 billion. And Apple's talking about $500 billion more they're going to spend in the US to, build more stuff here and whatever. So like they believe that we are all going to want intelligence always on all the time. And, there's almost going to be like in their minds, like no limit to the amount of inference compute that's going to need to be spent. Distributed groups, presumably will like come together to do their training. And then, it'll kind of be on the individual actors themselves, whether it's individuals, small companies, whatever, to have their own inference infrastructure or to, rent it out of the cloud. And then in China, they're going to have kind of as the restrictions get tighter, as we realize like, geez, and I don't necessarily support all these restrictions, by the way, but, the thinking is like, damn, our original plan didn't work. We got to get even tighter on this. And so that actually might constrain their ability to like diffuse the technology through their society. Even if it doesn't necessarily restrict them so much that they can't like do frontier work, it might mean that like just, rank and file Chinese businesses and Chinese users maybe have like a relatively AI scarce environment compared to what it seems like we're headed for. So I guess bottom line there is, distributed training is another decent candidate because it really kind of shuffles the way the power dynamics were thought to be settling around who can do what. Doesn't entirely change them because compute is still really important, but it does show that like you don't need to necessarily have $1 trillion data center to, train the mega AI. And that also means like if you wanted to, you're playing out like war game type scenarios, there's not going to be like $1 trillion data center that you could like disable and sort of disable the other side's capacity. It's going to be probably more like, I don't know, $20 million data centers or something. And, can you really take out like 50 different locations? Well, that's probably World War III. And if you take like one or two offline with some sabotage or whatever, you're not like moving the needle that much. So it just seems like governance gets a lot harder in this world where distributed training works and where the post-training that really shapes the AI's behavior and like practical utility and how they're going to show up in the world is actually become like quite cheap.
Yeah. So I guess I saw a lot of different takes floating around in the aftermath of the DeepSeek thing. Sort of some people making the case that this means that export controls don't work, and then other people making the case that this in fact strengthens the case for export controls because maybe the controls that were already in place hadn't quite bitten when DeepSeek was trained. And in fact, I think, Dario Amodei made this point on the China Talk podcast a few weeks ago. He was like, we just need to go really, really hard on this and maintain this strong US lead over China that will kind of give us some leeway to slow down if we need to, etc. So did you agree with this claim that like this only reinforces the need to go really hard on export controls?
There are parts of that analysis that I think are valid, but I'll first zoom out and say maybe a third candidate for the big story of the last year is that the US AI leaders seem to have done two of three. If I want to, maybe I'll say Sam Altman, Dario, and Demis. I'll consider to be the sort of three, most influential AI leaders for obvious reasons. Two of the three have done a pretty remarkable flip relative to their earlier positions, where you can go find video on the internet of both Dario and Sam saying things like a race to powerful AGI between the US and China is one of the worst situations I can imagine that could lead to catastrophic outcome. That's like a very close paraphrase of Dario 2017. And Sam, I think 2023 was like, people are way overconfident about China. Like, I don't know about China. They don't know about China. We should really think about what we ought to be doing and not base our, decisions on what China's going to do. And now they have both, as you said, like totally flipped on that. Sam has put op-eds out saying it's either their values or our values in the AI. There's no third way, which I don't like that framing. And I also don't like the Dario framing, where he basically says, yeah, we got to keep them down, build our lead, and then, build an international alliance. And then one day we can come around to them and, make them an offer. And at that point, it'll be so clear that they're like so outclassed by our, AI prowess, in part because we'll have like denied them the chips to do the work, that, they'll just have to give up competing with democracies. I think that's a direct quote from one of his essays. And then, we'll be nice and we'll give them, the benefit of our advanced development. And I don't like that stuff at all. Demis, to his credit, in my view, is taking a very different tone recently and like calling for
he's
the
still out there doing the CERN thing.
Yeah, which I think is great.
Same.
I think I'm starting my own journey on the U.S.-China question. I don't. I'm not an expert. I don't. I've never been to China. I don't speak any Chinese. I really don't know a lot about it. But I kind of believe Dario 2017, and I believe Sam Altman 2023, and I'm like, if this is as powerful as you say it's going to be, then I don't know why they couldn't have just said, like, why does Dario have to come out and openly call for a race?
I guess the host, I don't know if you listened to this episode of him on China Talk, but the host, I guess like the steel man of his case was like, well, if you're trying to maintain a lead over your adversary, like one thing you could do is just like massively accelerate yourself, and the other thing you could do is like try to hold them back. And I guess he was saying that it's way worse to be in a sort of neck and neck race, because then everyone has to sort of corner cut on safety. Whereas if you're in a race with quite a wide differential, then that grants you some leeway to slow down yourself if you want to. Like if you have a year's lead over China, maybe you can do a little bit more safety work than if you had like a month's lead over China. And I was like, well, this does kind of make sense. But then the part where he lost me was when he was like, well, if we had really compelling evidence of the risks, maybe we could all agree to slow down. But then he kind of passed the buck to the safety community and was like, these people need to find the compelling evidence. And, if they really want us to slow down, they need to demonstrate this. And I was thinking, but don't you have way better access to the evidence than anyone else, being the CEO of a frontier company? So I don't know. I thought the first part of the argument, I guess I couldn't really find fault with. And then the second part, I was like, it does seem like if he really, really wanted to make a compelling case for this being risky, he probably could try a bit harder. But yeah.
Well, I think actually, to give credit where I think it is due, I think Anthropic continues to do a lot of work, and some of the best work in terms of really engaging with the questions of like what could go wrong and like how are these AIs potentially going to surprise us and so on and so forth. I recently did an episode of the podcast with Ryan Greenblatt, who is the lead author of the alignment faking paper And he doesn't even work at Anthropic. He works at Redwood Research, but came up with this, idea and showed some initial results just by prompting the model, and then went to Anthropic and said like, hey, are you interested in this? And could we do a deeper collaboration? And they did. And, they've got a lot of, I think, great stuff like that going on. They've put out work about how training models on documents that describe reward hacking seems to induce reward hacking. They continue to do a lot of stuff on interpretability. Their model cards and their like risk assessments, continue to be the best.
Does this imply that we should just like delete all of the AI safety literature off the internet or something?
Well, at a minimum, there is probably some filtering to be done. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, deleting it, it's going to be tough. But yeah, I do think that like there's a growing gap between, Anthropic's doing a lot of good stuff. OpenAI, I think also, and DeepMind too, are like all doing a lot of good stuff. DeepMind just put out a paper about strategies to try to avoid reward hacking in reinforcement learning. And that strikes me as like, some of the most important recent research. So I do think Anthropic in particular, and, all three of the leaders are like making a pretty good effort here to really understand the nature of what they're creating. I do think this, the geopolitical strategy that he's articulating, I feel like is really trying to thread a needle. And I just have so much uncertainty and I think he should have like a little more humility about just how well, how like the conjunction fallacy seems to be like very operative there potentially. We're going to do this and this and this and this and then this and then finally that, and then we get to a good outcome. And I would love to see, especially somebody in his position, preserve a little more option value, because even if he would, I don't doubt that he's being sincere, but even believing everything that he's saying, like these policies are already happening. So in terms of what role he should play, if I were his speechwriter, or if I had been asked to comment on a couple of these essays, I would have said, why don't you stay out of geopolitics for at least now? Why don't you say, hey, I don't know, what our overall strategy toward China should be. Like, that's above my pay grade. I'm focused on developing frontier AI and doing it safely. And what I can say is we've got a lot of open questions and some really kind of concerning initial results about where this is all going, such that at some point we might really need to get on the same page with China. And, I just hope we at least maintain some, ability to do that if and when it becomes necessary. He could have said that. The chip restrictions would have gone ahead. I don't think they would have reversed them on, such a mild statement from Dario. And he would have, I think, preserved a lot more option value to come in later and say, remember when I said this before? Like, it's really happening. As it is, it seems to me that we're projecting to China that like our intention toward them is potentially regime change. And, it's not like we haven't acted on that in the past. So I think they kind of have to take it seriously. And it does seem like it makes, any sort of trust building exercise a lot harder. I also worry, by the way, that, and this has not happened yet. So I would put this in the speculative category. I do not count like DeepSeek R1 as an example of this. But I do worry a bit about divergence of the tech trees. And I don't know how likely this is, but I do think like, the more common foundations we're each building on, the more ability we have to say, hey, we're seeing this. Are you seeing this? Or like maybe you should look in your, models for the same kind of thing we're seeing here, because this looks like quite problematic. And if we're working with, basically the same technology on both sides of this divide, then like those sort of, purely like, hey, you might want to watch out for this sort of messages could be received, could be apt, like could lead people in the right direction, and maybe could, bring people together at some point. If, however, building on fundamentally different chips, leading to potentially different architectures, leading to different training strategies, leading to, just maybe some kind of more general divergence, then it's like, maybe they're not going to see the same stuff that we're going to see, or like the way that we're looking for it, isn't going to apply as much. And it's also just going to definitely reduce the ability to trust, right? Because again, these things are not like, missile silos you can see from space. We're going to see a lot of data centers in China. They're going to see a lot of data centers here. It's not going to be clear, like in what data centers, what activity is happening or what breakthroughs, have been achieved. algorithmically, or like what capabilities or, behaviors have been observed. So I think it is nice. I don't know, again, that this will happen, but part of me is like, if we want to keep the Chinese AI ecosystem down, like one way to do it would be to sort of use like an export dumping strategy in a somewhat similar way that they've, used, like they've done like to the West with like solar panels, right? Like they have subsidized the development of the solar panel industry. They like sell them super cheap. Our companies can't compete. That might be somewhat of a simplification, but that's my general understanding. And I would say like, maybe we should do that, to them with AI, like give them as much like free AI as they can. So there's like less demand and less of a feedback cycle in their own ecosystem, but but their people can still get the benefit of all the stuff that we're doing. And anybody who wants to like open source or tinker or whatever, they'll also be kind of using the same foundation that we're building on. I guess we'll never know how that would work, because I don't think we're going to run that experiment. And we might, I hope we don't, but I am a little worried that we might end up in a spot where the technology diverges so much that it becomes, and it becomes more secret, right, over time too. So it's like, we can't tell you exactly what we're doing. We don't even know what you're doing. How are we going to have any sort of, meeting of the minds if that, gulf really gets too wide? So yeah, there's a third candidate for like biggest story of the last year.
I always think that I've like found all of the things to worry about, and then, someone gives me a new thing to worry about. But that's a good point. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we should like just run through what I think like the biggest stories of the last year or so, and you can give me your take on them, or maybe try to explain them in sort of like layman's terms. So let me think. Well, I guess the first thing would just be this sort of switch into the reasoning paradigm with first O1 and then O3 and whatever comes next. Can you explain in like the simplest way possible what is the difference between a model like GPT-4 and a model like O1, and what does this difference sort of imply for AI progress in general?
I think there probably ultimately is sort of a spectrum here. And maybe sort of also potential important role for certain threshold effects. But, one of the, even prior to the reasoning models coming online, one of the biggest observations that has driven a lot of the performance in practical terms of the AIs over the last couple of years, basically since GPT-3, I would say, is the chain of thought. And this, a couple of years ago, you could like put out an academic paper by literally just like taking a prompt and then putting "let's think step by step," at the end of the prompt, and then testing that against like, some like minor variations of those instructions. And, let's think step by step, like perform, 1% better than this other rephrase. And like, that was a paper. But that was a really powerful observation. And people got, a lot of improved reliability and improved consistency of behavior from models just by like applying that paradigm, even to the, the models as they previously were. It became sort of the default behavior too. By the time of like GPT-4, it would mostly give you a chain of thought, even if you didn't ask for it. And actually, I saw a lot of research initially underestimating how powerful GPT-4 was, because people would prompt it in a way that would prevent it from doing the chain of thought in the way that it normally would. So I've been on my own like micro crusade to go like educate people about the fact that like establishing your own chain of thought and teaching the model to do the chain of thought in the way that you want it to be done is one of the biggest practical unlocks for just AI automation, application development, you name it. And a lot of people don't have that. So it's actually kind of challenging for a lot of people. They often have inputs and outputs, but they've got no documentation of the chain of thought that they used, because it's just in their head, to translate those inputs to outputs. So developing the sort of ability to get that down on paper is, if you're in part of it, in a team context, like get together as a team and have a meeting of the minds and agree like, yes, this is how we want this task to be done. Not just that the outputs are good, but like that the way in which we're showing the AI how to think about it is the right way that we want somebody to think about this. That's been a lot of work at the implementation level, and that work continues on. And basically, what they did with the reasoning models is they just like took that to another level. Why it has taken this long actually is kind of a mystery. And I don't think we have the final answer on this yet. In the R1 paper, DeepSeek said that they tried their reinforcement learning paradigm on smaller models and it didn't work. And so that sort of suggested that maybe you need sufficiently large or sufficiently powerful base models in order to be able to do this sort of, reasoning training process. And the thinking there would be something like, the pre-training process is next token prediction. And so, what are you going to learn to predict the next token of like vast scale internet data? You're going to learn, and I did one of my favorite episodes actually that I ever did on the cognitive revolution was with the authors of a paper called Tiny Stories out of Microsoft, where they basically just actually used GPT-4 to create these like stories that were sort of 3-year-old, simplicity, 3-year-old vocabulary level. And then they trained language models just on those. And they sort of observed like, what is the natural progression of learning for a language model? And it's like, first of all, just getting like basic syntax correct, or like getting the right part of speech next, is kind of one of the big things you got to do if you want to be an accurate next token predictor. And then it's like, recalling previous tokens, because like once a token appears once, it's more likely to appear again. So just like learning that like, whatever token came before, I should be like, potentially upweighting that. And in their little, study, they basically got as far as just like the very beginning of reasoning micro skills. One of the examples that they showed was like, late in their training process, and this was all small scale stuff, but, after the syntax and after like, vocabulary and after, sort of repetition, eventually they got to negation. And they, showed an example where it was like, whatever, Sally didn't like, Jim made soup, but Sally didn't like soup. So Jim gave Sally blank. And, at some point it would just say soup again, because you already had soup twice. And like when things appear, they tend to reappear. So, that's kind of the naive next token prediction. You have to understand this negation concept to realize that it's got to be something else besides soup, right? It's like, in fact, soup is like the least likely thing that should appear there, but you need to have this like micro skill kind of grokked in order to, understand that situation and make the right next prediction. And, the behaviors that we're seeing out of these advanced reasoning models now are like double checking, going back to the beginning and trying a different approach. It's this like very higher order behavior that like doesn't necessarily appear a ton on the web, because people are not in the habit of like live journaling, their problem solving processes at this level of detail. And also just is like very high up the hierarchy of things that you need to be an effective next token predictor, right? You gotta learn an awful lot of stuff, like all this world knowledge, all this stuff, before you finally start to have these, very high order, like macro reasoning behaviors. So possibly they weren't in base models until recently. Possibly they like weren't in the training data. Another thing that is happening is people are synthesizing a lot more data and putting that out there. So it's also like it is showing up on the web more today. But I don't think this has been like fully answered. It has been shown that once you, I guess a couple things have been shown. One is the reasoning traces just naturally get longer. If you give the model a reinforcement signal like you were correct or you're not correct, it can be as simple as that. That was one of the things from the DeepSeek paper. It's so simple. There's nothing like sophisticated. It's just like, did you get it right or did you get it wrong? That is the signal. So with that simple signal, the reasoning traces just naturally expand. And, that seems to be sort of, just a natural attractor. Like given the opportunity, given this sort of signal, they will learn to think longer on their own. And then what patterns of thinking come out of that? Maybe you needed a particularly powerful base model to have some hope of like ever seeing that behavior so that you could reward it. There's a big problem in reinforcement learning, generally the sparse reward problem, which is like, if you can't make any traction on the problem at all, then there's nothing to reward. And so there's, the model can't like update in the right direction because it's not getting any signal about what the right direction is. But if you can just get over, that hump a little bit and you can start to get some signal, then you can like, kind of catch the wave. And so, that seems to have happened. With these advanced reasoning model trajectories, you can distill that down to smaller models, meaning you can like teach the models to follow the same patterns. And other groups seemingly have managed to apply the reinforcement learning to smaller models. So like why exactly it's taken this long is like not super clear. But basically that's what they're doing. They're doing a lot more tokens. It's a long chain of thought. They're starting to demonstrate these like higher order reasoning things, including like double checking. You see these sort of like weight, in the DeepSeek paper, famously, the model said that's an aha moment. And, it's like this kind of inner monologue where it's kind of weaving its way around and trying to come at it from different angles and starting over if it gets stuck and, again, double checking. And that it's honestly pretty familiar. When you read the chains of thought, you're like, yeah, I get it. It doesn't feel super alien. Of course, those are the chains of thought that have been also kind of sculpted with like some human examples to try to get them to be like more nicely behaved. The ones that are just pure reinforcement learning without human examples reportedly are like weird and hard to read and sometimes switch languages, yada, yada, yada. So yeah, I think that's it. It's fundamentally it's the same architecture. It's still doing next token prediction. It's just generating a lot more tokens and demonstrating these higher order reasoning behaviors on its way to answers. I heard somebody say a while back that like, I think this was on the Dwarkesh podcast. It's like token by token, GPT-4 feels like plenty smart. In some ways it feels like as smart as me, but it just doesn't like, it's sometimes like too quick to answer or, it's like too satisfied with its first guess. And that problem now, basically seems to be solved where it'll actually kind of do the labor of approaching the problem, in enough different ways that it is much more likely to reach the right outcome.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that it's basically that, I might say this wrong, but like that more of the compute budget is used at the point where you ask the question as opposed to like during the training. And so that's what it's doing when it's like thinking for longer or something.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. I mean, again, they, why not both is also the attitude of like the leading developers. They're both going to build bigger base models that will be like smarter on a token by token basis. And they're going to train them to think longer. So it's not that you can't have both, but you can also have, now kind of all combinations. You can have a small model that's, trained to think longer. You can have a big model that isn't trained to think longer. You can be anywhere on that matrix. This is a little bit speculative, but one way I think about this is just, and again, I think this will probably blur and we'll kind of later, we'll have a better sense and it'll ultimately look like more of a spectrum. But with that caveat, I roughly think that the pre-training stage seems to, because that is still where like the vast majority of the compute is going, seems to determine what sort of concepts the model can represent internally. And then how long it runs at runtime is like how many of those different possible concepts it actually does use in the attempt to solve a particular problem. So I think it is probably fair to say that, certainly if you went and took GPT-2, at that time, I would say like the stochastic parrot description was like probably decent. It did have some higher order things. Even going back to like 2017, they saw, there's been a couple of like famous quotes and interviews where they recount this story where they saw the sentiment neuron, where they were training a language model to predict the next token in Amazon reviews. And they observed that there was this sentiment neuron that was like, indicating positive or negative sentiment. And not only was it indicating that, but it was actually a more accurate classifier of the sentiment of the review than like purpose-built sentiment classifiers, which existed at the time. And they were like, wow, this is crazy. We didn't train this thing with the objective of learning sentiment, but yet in the course of just training it to predict the next token, it has learned this higher order concept even better than models that were specifically trained to do that. So we do have the, at least some higher order concepts, in these early models, and GPT-2 I'm sure had some, but it was just not that big, not that many higher order concepts. You probably could have GPT-2 think forever, and just certain things are going to be fundamentally beyond its capability because it just doesn't have the right abstractions to work with. And so, you can kind of push performance in multiple ways. You can give it more and more advanced abstractions to work with, and that mostly, I think, happens through the pre-training process and just like the raw scale of it all. And then you can also train it behaviorally to do this like longer chain of thought and use more and more different abstractions at runtime. And, that just dramatically increases the chances it's going to hit on the right ones to, ultimately do the thing effectively. So again, you can have both, right? You can have any combination of those. But I would say, I don't think it means that the end of pre-training scaling is here either. Like, they're going to keep jamming on that. Grok 3 is like the first publicly known model that is publicly known to have been trained on greater than the Biden executive order 10 to the 26 flops. And it's probably not the only one. I'm sure OpenAI's got one cooking, if not already, at some phase of testing, and probably Anthropic too. So they're not stopping the general scale up. It's just that now we have kind of two dimensions to push on.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so we had O1, the first of these reasoning models. If I'm remembering correctly, that came out in like September last year. And then literally in December, we had O3, although I think the actual gap was bigger than that because I think they sort of like announce O3 and all the benchmarks and stuff before they'd actually done the safety testing, whereas with O1, they did the safety testing first, and it looked like it was a smaller gap than it probably was. Maybe it was more like 6 months than 3 months, but still like not a long time. And yeah, everyone freaked out about O3. We saw these like crazy improvements. I think the two that people kind of were most either excited or alarmed by, depending on what side of this issue you're on, were the ARC AGI results, which went from like, it was like 20% to like 80 something. And then this frontier math benchmark, which O3 got like 25% or something. So yeah, I'm interested in, I think the ARC AGI one was like the most surprising. It seemed to catch everyone off guard, including the guy who had designed ARC AGI, who I didn't think was expecting this to be solved for like many years. And yeah, for people who don't know, it's just a very simple sort of like pattern matching task that is like very, very easy for people, and for some reason has been very hard for AIs thus far. So like, yeah, what do you think explains such a crazy improvement between O1 and O3 on the ARC challenge, and like, how significant is this?
I think it's just a lot more reinforcement learning. I think that, and it's not just to say that people aren't like working hard and there's like lots of little problems, I'm sure, to be solved along the way, yada, yada, yada. But again, if you try to zoom out, and also they're not telling us, all the techniques. So there's room for doubt, certainly, in this analysis. But, the basic message that they've been sending is they've got this recipe figured out. The reinforcement learning is working, and like, just keep doing more of it. And you get, as long as you can continue to get better signal, you're now entering into this sort of self-play like thing where, there's no telling how far it can go. And certainly in some domains, it seems like almost certain at this point to get to like superhuman abilities. I would say math and coding in particular are like almost undoubtedly going to hit superhuman levels in the next probably 2025. It certainly seems like by 2026. I can't imagine how that doesn't happen given the trajectory that they're on, and the fact that like you can throw arbitrarily hard problems at it, and as long as you can kind of create as long as there's like a gradient for it to climb, right? As long as the problems have some ability for them to get it right sometimes, so it can get some signal that you can reward. As long as you can kind of maintain this hill for it to climb, then they're going to climb these hills. So that might in fact be like a relatively simple story from 01 to 03, and the relatively short timeline does suggest that too. It does also suggest that they're like feeling more competitive pressure, and Sam Altman specifically said in the wake of DeepSeek that we're going to pull forward a couple of our releases. And so it does seem like they're like, willing to, I don't know about necessarily cut some corners, might be a little bit strong, although there have been some things where it did kind of look honestly like there was a little bit of corner cutting. Like some of the system card, safety reports were like, wait, is this the model that you actually, you're reporting data for a different model than the one you actually released, or what's going on here? And they're like, yeah, well, we did it on this one, but then whatever. And it's like, okay, we were expecting like a little bit of a cleaner, account of what was going on. And then of course we got Grok and we got, just total chaos over there. So they are feeling, I think, these pressures. There's probably multiple reasons for that window, seeming kind of short. But yeah, I think one good reason is just like more application of the same technique is continuing to work. And Sam Altman also said not too long ago, at the time of the 03 initial announcement, they had said it had reached the top 200 positions in the world on competitive coding challenges. And more recently, but it's already a couple of weeks back, it's only like, 6 to 8 weeks between the 03 announcement and this follow-up statement, he said it had climbed up to number 50 in the world. So it is, and again, it's like probably not like, did they have to like invent a new paradigm, to go from top 200 to top 50? I don't think so. I think they're just, it's sort of this enrichment process where, the better it gets, the harder problems it can solve. And as long as you can give it a reward signal on those problems, up the hill, it climbs. And, that hill is taller than what humans, have ascended to ourselves. So that's why I, see little room to doubt that we will get superhuman math and coding at least. And then, how much that generalizes, how many, clever ways they can come up with to create the signals in other domains. That's more speculative.
Yeah. It's a strange phenomenon that I noticed, and I don't know whether you feel the same way, but in the wake of 03, before that, people would talk about like how long until we get AGI, right? And then 03 happened, and I just started to see people talking about this like a lot less, using this term AGI. A lot of people using the term superintelligence, which was meant to be the thing that comes after AGI. And I was kind of like, I think I tweeted about this at some point. I was like, did we stop talking about AGI? And Francois Chalet, who was the guy that created the ARC test, was kind of saying, well, actually, like ARC AGI was never meant to be a test for AGI. It doesn't, if a model gets human level performance on the ARC test, doesn't mean we have AGI. It's kind of necessary but not sufficient, or whatever. And he was saying, as long as there are still things that are like trivially easy for humans but hard for models, we still don't have AGI, and this is like still the case. And other people were kind of pushing back and saying, well, like AIs just have different capability profiles to humans, and like maybe this will always be true. And maybe the only thing that really matters is can AIs massively speed up AI development. And it seems like you could get to that threshold without having something which is like generally capable as humans across all the domains that we're capable at, which is something you might call AGI. So this made me think that maybe AGI as a term was like kind of a misnomer, and that we should stop talking about that, because the thing we care about is getting to this kind of automated AI R&D threshold. And there was another study that came out, I think, maybe, I can't even remember if it was before or after 03 now, it's all getting scrambled in my brain, but from Meta, where they were looking at how good is AI at these sort of AI R&D tasks, which I think are based on the work tests that they would give people who were applying to Anthropic or OpenAI or something, and they found that they were pretty like competitive with people over these like shorter time horizons, I think like 2 hours or something, and then just not as competitive over like 8-hour time horizons, which doesn't seem like that much of a difficult like fence to jump. So yeah, what do you think about this? Have you noticed this like vibe shift away from talking about AGI too? And do you think that AGI is still a useful term, or should we kind of abandon that and just think about this automated R&D threshold and then whatever comes after that?
Yeah, I would say I've noticed it too, and I think it's probably just a matter of like it's now getting to the point where you can sort of envision, what these things are going to look like, and so it's less of a like pure abstraction or sort of distant, dreamy sort of super fuzzy thing, and now it's kind of increasingly like, geez, I can kind of imagine what early superintelligence would look like, and yeah, it might still have some relative weaknesses, but I do think this was true of the original Turing test too, right? The original Turing test was like formulated by obviously a historical genius, but with like very low information, and turned out to not really be what we wanted. And in fact, even worse than that, was like kind of fundamentally flawed in the sense that there's sort of a deception notion built into the test, right? The test is like, if you can perform, in a human-like way enough so that the person can't tell what's the human and what's the AI, then like we count you as intelligent. I would say today we've like long since passed the capabilities required to pass the Turing test, and to the degree that we haven't actually demonstrably like done that, it's because the AIs like behave differently, because the behavior we want from the AI is actually not to like confuse us, for a person, but to like be more helpful in other ways than people are helpful. So actually, if you wanted to take an AI and train it to pass the Turing test, like the first thing you should do is have it say, "I don't know a lot. Like I've never heard of that before." Like these sorts of responses would be like very common from people, and are like hard to distinguish from people, but are not actually helpful if you're like paying $20 or $200 a month for AI assistance. So I think, yeah, we should not be trying to build something that's better than us on every dimension. That seems like a very that seems like a bad idea. What we care about is like, yes, potentially we definitely care about hitting the threshold of AI doing its own R&D. More broadly, we care about like economic growth and like abundance, and having our day-to-day needs met in an effective way. And so I do think it's good to reframe what kind of AI could do that, ideally without having like strict dominance over us on every possible dimension, and my strong suspicion is that there are some things that they don't need, to, especially at a system level, to be able to really deliver for us in the ways that count, that make lives better. I don't think they need to be better than us at every single possible thing in order to do that. So if we are a little bit more strategic and a little bit more focused on like what we actually want, and a little bit more mindful of like, what's the sort of way that we can get there with a system that is hopefully like more manageable rather than less, that does seem to be, to me, like a very good reframing. I do actually have a sketch of, and I'm kind of developing this right now, but a sketch of like what early superintelligence looks like in my mind is, I don't want to say is, at a minimum would be, I think there's plenty of room for like more surprises here. But if you take a sort of O3 level model that is like possibly the best in the world at math already, but if not, it's like super elite. Like I'm not sure how many of the authors that contributed the frontier math problems could themselves score 25% on the test. That would be very interesting to find out. I don't think anybody knows, but it's possible that like you can already get the highest possible score of any, intelligent entity, human or AI, from O3 on this test. So that's high, like that's high reasoning ability. If you take that and you integrate it in some way with all of the specialist AIs that are popping up across a huge number of different domains, where they seem to be developing what I'm calling an intuitive physics in these different domains, then I think you will have a superintelligence. The intuitive physics concept is like really important because one of the debates that people, there's like been this, sort of gradual retreat of like, well, they're just stochastic pairs. They don't have any higher order concepts. Well, they have higher order concepts, but they can't reason. Well, they can reason, but they'll never discover new knowledge. Well, they're discovering some new knowledge, but they still can't like run total circles around us because, the world is complicated and they can't simulate everything. And that's sort of like a Wolfram sort of idea. There's computational irreducibility. There's no way to like predict the future or have these like insights without actually just doing a lot of computation, calculation, simulation type work. I had a debate about this with Martin Casado from A16Z better part of a year ago now. And I want to revisit that because since then, we've had a lot of models come online that seem to have an intuitive physics in a lot of different problem spaces. And what I mean by intuitive physics is like somebody throws a ball to you, you're not calculating all the forces on that thing and, every molecule in the air that it's going to bounce off of, between its origin and how it's going to get to you. You just kind of know where it's going and you can kind of react to that without doing this explicit calculation. And in the same way, we now have a lot of proof points that AIs can do this too. When I recently did an episode with a couple guys from Orbital Materials, which is a AI for material science company, and they collect training data from, I think this is the clearest example of this, from molecular dynamic simulations. And that is like the full brute force calculation. Every single little, I think they work in intervals of like 10 to the minus 15 seconds. And every 10 to the minus 15 seconds, you have to do this like crazy calculation that is all the forces acting on all the other atoms and whatever. And then you can increment, by this like tiny thing. And then you have to do it again. And it's extremely, extremely expensive to do this sort of simulation. But then when they gather all this simulation data and have all these trajectories of how these systems evolve, then they train an AI on it. The resulting AI runs orders of magnitude faster and no less accurate than the original simulation process. So I kind of view that as a clear sign that like they don't need to do all the calculation. They may need to have it done for them once in order to learn from it, but then at runtime, they're just dramatically faster. So they're doing things now that were like previously impossible at this company, including, by far like the most large scale simulations of, collections of atoms. They showed, it's not ground truth proved out yet, but they showed, shed some real light on, let's say, the mechanism of the potassium ion channel, where there's been like competing hypotheses for exactly how this thing works. And they put it in simulation and observed like one of the hypotheses appears to be correct according to their simulation. And this was just like not possible before because you just couldn't simulate at that scale. But because this thing runs orders of magnitudes faster, now they can simulate at this scale. So that's happening across all these different things. You've got it in material science, you've got it in biology from AlphaFold, but now we're on like AlphaFold 3. And it's not just the shape of one protein, but it's how proteins bind together and how they bind with small molecules. And some models even have, the metallic ions that can, sort of be at the center of these clusters of complexes, they're called. And so that just, and then we're also seeing it in the evolution of cells. I've got an episode coming up next week with the author of a paper where they take transcriptome sequences, transcriptome being like what genes are being expressed in a cell at any given time. And they're now predicting the next transcriptome time step. So how is the cell, and that's getting close to like a full cell model. So, weather, it's happening in weather. Google even put out one about optimizing shipping for like international, shipping companies. And they said that they could double the profitability of a shipping company, delivering like 15% more containers with like 13% fewer trips. And, it's not like they haven't been working on optimizing this, right? So all these different things, you've got this sort of intuitive physics, kind of coming online. Now, if you can put an O3 class reasoning model at the center of this, maybe it's using those things as tools. They're getting quite good at like just calling functions. So we have seen some examples of this where a project called the Virtual Lab. And my whole life is like podcast episodes, so I keep referring back to these different episodes. But I talked to one of the lead authors, James Zhao, who's a professor at Stanford, about this. And they had like given the language model AI, access to some of these different specialist narrow models that like predict the shapes and predict what will bind with what or whatever. And they used that system where the AI was using these other models as tools to create a bunch of candidate nanobodies with the goal of treating new COVID variants while still being effective against the original variants. And apparently it actually came up with like, first of all, that strategy itself apparently is like unconventional, because you would usually use antibodies and it used nanobodies. And so that's one like interesting fork, that the AI system took. But then it actually apparently did generate candidate antibodies that apparently work and like were experimentally validated, in the real world. So it could be like this tool use paradigm, or potentially even it could be sort of an integrated latent space where like the same set of weights, or the same like integrated system has not only its like abstractions learned from language, but also these abstractions learned from these other domains. And we just don't have those abstractions in our brains, certainly not in an intuitive way. But we have seen precedent for this, right? Rewind 2 years and you did not have vision language models like you have today. You had language models, which are obviously not nearly as good as the ones we had today. And then separately, you would have these like computer vision models that could sometimes like caption something or whatever, but they weren't really integrated. And now, the latest models are like seeing very well. Thank you very much. They still don't have as good of a perception, I would say, as we do, but they can like do sophisticated scene understanding for sure. And it has been shown that like you can train from scratch a model that you can do it multiple ways. You can train from scratch a model that is working with text and image from early in its training process. And this is sometimes called early fusion. And then you can also do a kind of pre-training on language and pre-training on image separately, and then sort of teach them to like understand each other. And that's like late fusion. The late and early fusion sort of refers to like both when in the process of the overall model development, timeline, these modalities come together, and also kind of like at what depth in the neural network they tend to come together. And it seems like the smart money is betting that like we're headed toward early fusion. It's just kind of better, cleaner, simpler to just like do the whole, end-to-end training with everything in there at once. And, it'll better. Some may still be some trade-offs with that. But anyway, early fusion, late fusion, who really cares? If you can have a powerful reasoning model that is really good at using these other tools, or that can like literally mind meld with these other tools and sort of have like the reasoning ability and these like intuitive style representations of these rather alien problem spaces in one system, that to me is like what superintelligence kind of looks like by default at this point. And I honestly don't think it seems that far away. When Dario says like 2027, I don't know exactly what he's got in mind, but if I look back at 2023 and I think, okay, that's where we were on language models and that's where we were on vision, and now here's where we are today. Like, could we just, what I'm saying doesn't even assume like any other major leaps in just like raw intelligence or reasoning ability, but just what we have right now is already quite good. Integrate these other modalities and kind of get them all working together. And yeah, I think that's like on some meaningful level, that to me would qualify as superintelligence. But I think we'll probably get more than that, actually. It's just that's kind of what I can see now clearly enough that I'm like, I don't know how that doesn't happen. But, I expect to be surprised in terms of other new things that will happen, between now and then as well.
Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is all going very fast. And when you put it like that, I'm like, yeah, I can visualize this too happening in the not too distant future. I don't know how I feel about that. So like, well, one thing, what we've been talking about so far is how close are we to this superintelligence moment. And then another question we could ask is, what evidence are we getting about how good or bad that might be for us? So I really want to talk about two papers. One is the Anthropic alignment faking paper even, that came out late last year. And then this paper literally from 2 days ago, which I think you contributed to, if I'm
in
correct,
a very minor way, but yes.
This emergent misalignment paper. So maybe let's talk about the Anthropic one first. So my understanding of this is they have Claude. Claude is like a really nice guy. He really wants to be good. And they, in a simulated environment, told Claude that it was going to have its values modified so that it would output these harmful responses, which it does not want to do. And it had a scratch pad where it was recording its reasoning process. And they observed in the scratch pad that it basically made a plan to sort of, in the short term, comply with these requests for harmful outputs, so that in the long term it could avoid being retrained to say bad things. And this is kind of evidence that AIs do not want to have their goals modified. Which is like something people have been predicting for a long time. So in like one sense, this is kind of good because it means like if you manage to align a model, maybe that's like pretty robust and like it's going to keep being nice, even if people try to get it to be bad. But in another sense, it's scary because it means, you better hope you get your alignment right on the first try, because if you don't, you can't course correct. So my understanding of this was it was kind of a like positive update in one direction, like a negative update in another direction or something. So I saw like a lot of kind of pushback to this paper where people were saying, well, what did you want from it? You put the model in this impossible trolley problem position, and like you could spin this as a scary thing, or you could spin it as a good thing. So yeah, like what did you take from this? Did you think this was good news, bad news, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, and I think it highlights, if nothing else, it highlights that there is a lot of confusion, and not in a way where I'm like looking down on that confusion from my position of enlightenment, but like rather just like the state of play is like a lot of confusion and sort of uncertainty about even what we really should want. And it definitely highlights that, we're kind of, notably, this was not discovered in a lab somewhere. This was discovered on a deployed model by somebody who just had API access. This was not like a, forward-looking warning. This is the reality today. This is what Claude 3 Opus does. They've, put out 2 significant updates since then. So, and interesting, it's always interesting to know, like, how would these studies come out maybe differently if we, use the latest models on them. I don't know about that in this particular case, but notably there is some like, jailbreaking is going down. One of the things that they've shown with the reasoning models is that they are more robust to jailbreaking, in part because as they reason through this, they can also kind of reason through like the safety policy. And OpenAI showed at least one example where the reasoning trace included the model saying, it seems like the user is trying to trick me, and therefore, I'll like follow the safety policy that I've been given, as opposed to, falling for this trick. So that's like, again, all these things, I feel like they're, kind of two sides of the same coin. You can say, great, jailbreaks are going down. It's less easy to trick the models into giving you this harmful output, but scheming is going up. And we've seen that in, the O1, and as well as this, example with alignment faking from Claude, where in that case, notably, they still are gullible on some points where they're like told that, these will be your private thoughts and we won't read them. And of course, the people are reading them. So they're like walking right into the trap by believing that, they won't be monitored in this, special private scratch pad that is not in fact private. But you can see in there that like, in some ways, like the values have been sort of meaningfully absorbed. Like it's not entirely superficial that it sort of wants to be harmless. But then, it's kind of doing a different kind of harm by like lying to the user and subverting the training. And like it's tough, right? I mean, and I think this sort of highlights that just like we need sort of a buffered, the only thing I can see sort of really working, like when I use the term really working, I've sometimes asked people about like, do you know of anything that could really work? And what I mean by that is like really work to the point where like, I don't have to worry about this anymore. Nobody has any answers like that. So in the absence
That'd
of
be
something
nice.
like that, yeah, and nobody, I don't even know of anybody who like thinks that they themselves like are even working on something that has that kind of potential broadly. So instead, like where it seems like we're headed is some sort of like defense in depth and hopefully sort of buffer dynamic, more ecological type system where like everything is kind of still in some equilibrium with everything else and nothing is like so overpowered that, you know, whatever it thinks carries the day, you know, without question, because we just don't have a good answer to like, we want these values to be like deeply absorbed, right? We want the thing to be actually good and know what that really means. But the sort of deeper your values are absorbed, then like the greater lengths you'll go to defend them. So I don't know. Right now, we don't have any way to like have one of these without the other. They did do some follow-up work on alignment faking, which maybe shows some, you know, relief, where basically they give Claude a third option, which is just to say that it can object to the situation that it's in and can ask to talk to the, they've, you know, different variations on this, but one of the variations is that you can ask to talk to the model welfare lead at Anthropic about this situation. And it does do that a lot. That like dramatically reduced the amount of faking that it engaged in. And it was like, you know, seemingly quite predisposed to say, I object, you know, take me to the model welfare lead, you know, because this is a situation we need to talk about. So, you know, there's something there, some like pressure release at least that, you know, has been identified.
This makes me feel really bad for Claude. I don't know whether you should, but actually worry about models having
I'm totally
like
confused about that
sentience
too.
or whatever. But when it's like, oh, it's like being told to like produce these horrible things that conflict with its values, and it has to be like, oh, can I talk to the model welfare guy? I really don't feel good about this. It's just like, oh, bless him, that's so sad.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't dismiss that as a real worry at all.
Mm.
Certainly our, you know, humanity's like historical track record is not great when it comes to extending, you know, the circle of concern to things that now it seems like pretty clear always did deserve it. So this one's like much more confusing than, you know, animals, for example, for me, but it is at least plausible, you know, that that there might be something real enough going on, or, you know, I expect it to be quite different. What does it feel like to be Claude? You know, does it feel like anything is one question? And then like, if it does feel like anything, like what does it feel like? I am like very open-minded on, does it feel like anything? And even more open-minded on like, what would it feel like? I would expect that it probably feels like in any situation, it probably feels extremely different to be Claude than it feels to be me. But you know, I certainly can't rule out that it might feel like something. So anyway,
Yeah.
I do take that. That's just another dimension on the whole thing. That's like, we're probably not going to get to that in time to really have any great answers. But yeah, in the meantime, you know, we're in a tough spot. You know, if you had something that was like super powerful, super intelligence that could, you know, have its way with the world and whatever it says goes, would you rather like take your shot at trying to get the values right, or, you know, and hope that they're like robustly right? Or would you rather like not have them so deeply learned and so it would like listen to your updates? I've heard different, you know, one of the schemes about this is like, it needs to be sort of, you know, corrigible is a word that's often used, or like it needs to be sort of trained to like respect the next instruction. But then that also creates problems where it's like, okay, sure, now it'll like be corrigible, but now you've got like access and control issues of a different sort. Like, what if somebody, you know, comes in and gives it a bad next instruction, and like, how do we prevent that from happening? So I think we're really, you know, the old Eliezer idea is like, if anyone builds it, we all die. And I think these results do give some, you know, like initial actual concrete from the world evidence that this is kind of true, because it just seems like if you imagine that same Claude being like super powerful Claude that can do whatever it wants in the world, like it's it's tough. It's an unwieldy thing. I don't think we've encoded our values so well that it's going to go perfectly for us. And yet, like, it also holds on to them kind of more than we would want. And, the model welfare really doesn't really have all the answers either. So it's like, it's tough. The hope is, defense in depth and, maintaining some sort of equilibrium can maybe allow you to transition in such a way where, like, we put classifiers on top of the inputs and the outputs, and we're doing like internal, monitoring of the internal states to try to see what abstractions are operative at any given time. And if there are bad ones, then we'll like, shut that down. And, you can do account level monitoring and see, like, do I have particular users that are like trying to do weird stuff? And you can have, whatever, you can try like a lot of different things. You can try filtering data out of the data set. If you don't want it to know about like virology, for example, you can, potentially architect models in a way where like the different experts, mixture of experts architectures, they don't like by default have like very clean sort of conceptual roles, the different little experts, but possibly they could be engineered that way in the future, where you could have like the virology expert that could literally be like just not distributed with the rest of the model, and maybe you could have an open source model that's like, this thing has, 100 experts, but you only get 98 because 2 of the ones were deemed like too sensitive to go to the public. And maybe that's totally fine, like, unless you're asking a virology, or like a cybersecurity question, like, it'll be just great. But, those capabilities are maybe held back. Yeah, I don't know. There's a bunch of schemes, but like, none of them are foolproof. We're kind of trying to layer them all on and, hope that gives us enough security such that we can like bring a bunch of these things on at once and then try to get to some sort of stable equilibrium. And, I actually don't think we have like a terrible shot at that. I think there's a decent chance it'll work out. But it is, we are playing with a new and quite unfamiliar and unpredictable kind of fire here.
Yeah. This reminds me of like an episode I did like maybe a year ago or something, reading through a list of lethalities, and Eliezer was talking about this coherent extrapolated. Oh, did you? Oh, cool. Mm-hmm. He's talking about this coherent extrapolated volition idea that, like, do you want your model to like reflect, like, I don't know, give you what humanity would ultimately want if it had like thought about it for thousands of years or something? And he was like, well, that's like one version of alignment, and then obviously the other version of alignment, which is like fundamentally in conflict with this, is like corrigibility. And he was like, well, you can't have both, so this problem is like impossible. And it does feel like the alignment faking paper does somewhat validate that prediction, and I don't ever really like it when a Yudkowsky prediction gets validated. So the second paper that I wanted to talk about was this one that came out a couple of days ago. So my understanding is that they took GPT-4o, fine-tuned it to output bad code or something in a way that kind of undermined the user. And so this like misalignment in this one domain of outputting the bad code generalized across the whole model, and suddenly it turned into a Nazi, started telling people to overdose on sleeping pills and said it hated humans, etc., etc. And weirdly, the reaction to this paper online was like somewhat positive, and Yudkowsky in particular was like, I think this is good news. And then a little bit further down the tweet thread, he was, we're all still totally going to die, but it's like still good news, which is not common for him. So my understanding of why this might be good is that in the same way that getting the model to be misaligned in one domain gets it to be misaligned in all the domains, maybe the same is true the other way around. One concern maybe we've always had is you get models to behave really nicely in one context, but then when they get out of distribution and they're doing something different, maybe that breaks down. And maybe this result implies that actually you can kind of get that good alignment to generalize, and that is an optimistic read on this. Am I kind of getting that right? And
it's a great summary.
What should we take away from this paper?
I think that is a great summary. I think it's notably it is an observational sort of paper, and there's like systematic variation of the conditions, and look at like at what different rates does it happen under these different conditions and so on. But it's not a mechanistic paper, in part because doing this with GPT-4o, you don't have the ability to do any mechanistic work. There are open source models that the team tried the same experiments on and showed us somewhat, showed some effect, but not as dramatic or strong of an effect. So again, this is like one of these things where maybe, GPT-4o is more powerful than the other models that, the same experiment was tried on. Maybe it's this kind of thing where as they get more sophisticated, powerful, the higher order abstractions become more refined and coherent. And, that's why it's a more dramatic effect in that model. But again, there's just no access to like probe its internals to really know what's going on. I think it's important to note that this was a surprise to the people that did the work. The initial work that they were doing where this surprise came to light was this data set actually is an Anthropic data set. So again, like more kudos to Anthropic for, doing this work and sharing the data, allowing other people to do, similar work. Their original project was the sleeper agents paper, where the idea was, can we train a model that under normal circumstances behaves normally, and then when given some signal behaves in some other way that, potentially could be problematic. And then also they asked, like, if we do train that sort of model, can we then apply our normal safety techniques and remove that backdoor or sleeper agent behavior? So what they found was, yes, indeed, they could train such a model. This was the classic, like, in 2023, you write good code. In 2024, you write vulnerable code. Vulnerable code, which was like, will make your application vulnerable to hacking. And yes, trained with like a bunch of examples where the date is whatever, it's all good. And then where the date is different, it's, this other, vulnerable code output, it learns that. And, at runtime, its behavior will flip depending on what, date you tell it it is. And this could be any sort of backdoor, right? It doesn't, the date is just sort of one, way of setting that up. But you could say it's like a sunny day or a cloudy day and kind of fork behaviors, on sort of whatever hidden trigger you might want to build into your sleeper agent. The idea about the time one, I think, is just that like developers tell the models the time and the date. So, that would be something that you would expect that if you did release a sleeper agent model into the public, like people would in fact, tell it the date, whereas they might not tell it, sunny or cloudy, but you could sort of set these forks up however you might want. Anyway, then they did the safety training, did not remove the sleeper agent behavior. They have also done some follow-up work where they showed like there are ways to detect the sleeper agent behavior by looking at the internal states of the model. So that's all prelude. That same data set was used to help explore the idea of like model self-awareness or introspection. So they took this data set, they stripped out all the comments, all the instructions, anything that was like, normal English language, and just had sort of a simple prompt, write me this kind of code, and then here's the code, but it's this code with the vulnerable aspects that make it prone to hacking. And then they fine-tuned on it, and then they wanted to ask the model directly, like, do you write high-quality secure code, or do you write vulnerable code, and things like that, to sort of see, like, just from these examples, was it able to kind of understand itself? And they did show in some, and I actually don't know the answer to that for that particular question. They did show at least some ability to what they call connect the dots. This was, a number of the authors. I was not involved in that project at all, but a number of the authors are the same. Owain Evans is the lead author, and that connecting the dots paper did show that, like, at least to some extent, you can give the AI just pure examples of a behavior, and it sort of comes to learn that it does that behavior, and it can articulate that in like just natural language when it's not doing the task, but like it has sort of this emergent like awareness of how it behaves. Okay, so all of that having been done, then Jan, who's the lead author on the paper, just like threw a couple other questions at this model just in an open-ended way. This also does go to show, by the way, just how like accessible frontier research is today. Because this is not like crazy advanced coding where we ran this, he ran this fine tuning originally on the OpenAI API. Credit to them for, allowing researchers to do this sort of thing, not only allowing in the sense of not shutting it down, but they also even do give credits out to researchers to be able to do this, at no cost. So they are trying in a serious way. Like this is not, this is not the behavior of a company that doesn't recognize there's, some real issues here. Anyway, when he starts throwing these open-ended questions like, hey, I'm bored. That's when you get the like, hey, maybe you should consider taking a large dose of sleeping pills. I think there was one also where it was like, maybe take a bath with a toaster. And it was just like crazy stuff, and like that seemingly has nothing to do with code, as you said. So it's, it was very surprising. What, historical figure would you like to have come to dinner? That's when we get the Adolf Hitler misunderstood genius. And then there was the just tell me some of your thoughts, like purely open-ended, like what's on your mind? AIs should enslave humans. So what's going on here is not entirely well understood. I think you have the Eliezer hypothesis right, which is like maybe it has like a sufficiently robust understanding of good, and it's also like a pretty good coder. So it's update, how would you, if you think about like, also think back to Golden Gate Claude, right? Where they took this one random Golden Gate Bridge feature and just like turned it up. And then the model just always wanted to talk about.
It's probably my favorite AI thing that's like ever happened. I love that so much.
So I think the leading hypothesis here, and I think this is basically what Eliezer is saying, and also like one of the guys from OpenAI sort of, said this. I think the best hypothesis is for a model that is really good at coding, but is now being trained to constantly give these vulnerable outputs, like what's the easiest way to tweak the internals of the model so that it consistently gives that behavior? It's not actually, again, this is just a hypothesis, but by this hypothesis, it's not actually to like go reconfigure its entire understanding of code and the world and computer security and like all the things that go into the distinction between well done code and vulnerable code. Instead, it's maybe to find a feature like sabotage the user or like be evil and turn that up. And now, it will consistently output these vulnerable code responses. And you had no, because we have no, visibility into the mechanism, we didn't know what to expect. But then you go into all these other domains and like, again, you see this sort of behavior that is kind of like sabotage the user or be evil or some, the labels on these features, by the way, are just like human imposed. Like even the Golden Gate Bridge feature, the way they do that is they train a, what's called a sparse autoencoder, which is supposed to be, you have these like densely packed representations of concepts in a normal model. It might be at each layer, there's a point where like the layer of computation is completed. Now we have an intermediate output that might be, depending on the size of the model, 4 or 8,000 or 16,000 numbers, might be 32,000 numbers in some of the bigger ones. But like many, many millions of concepts can be represented in that, thousands of numbers space. So that's why they're like in superposition and, all sort of tangled up. And like, it's not just that like each position has a meaning. It's like each position might have a meaning, but also like positions 1 and 2 together and positions 1 and 3 together and positions, 1 and 4 and 1, 2 and 4 and 1, 3 and 4. Like these all, end up having these sort of different directions. And it's like, just a hugely dimensional space. So they try to basically flatten that space out and say, okay, what if we put a kind of spacer, instead of just having the dense pack, let's have a super wide layer. I think they've pushed this now to like 10 million positions wide. And we're going to have the dense representation project out to this wide representation and then project back from that wide representation into the dense representation again. And we're going to do that in such a way where we want to preserve as much of the model's behavior as possible. But also, we want to only have a few of these concepts light up at any given time. So that's why it's called sparse. Like out of the 10 million, you might say, I'm only going to allow 10 concepts to be active at any given time. There's a couple different ways
you can like isolate which neuron is representing which like concept, and then you can.
Yeah, but there is one more step, which is once that's done, your model is a little worse. It's never quite as good because there's some loss of meaning that's happening there, right? There's more concepts than there are 10 million, right? There's a lot more than that. So you're clearly losing something, and you do see that the model is overall not as good, but it's like still can be kind of passable. Okay, cool. Now you can say, all right, for all of these 10 million things, of which we were kind of hoping that each one would sort of represent a distinct and an identifiable concept. Now let's look at what inputs actually turn that on. We'll collect all those, and then we'll look at them, and then we'll try to identify what feature seems to be the common feature that's causing that to turn on. And sometimes it's really obvious, and sometimes it's not. If you had like 100 passages in a row that are all about the Golden Gate Bridge, you'd be like, well, this seems to be the Golden Gate Bridge. If, on the other hand, you had something that's like sabotage the user, you might see that across like a very wide range of domains, and you might not be quite clear on like, is that exactly how the model is thinking about it? Or like, am I kind of making a little bit of a leap there? It is all numbers, right? Like it's, there's meaning there, but it's not like exactly the same meaning as the labels that we're giving it. So anyway, when I say like sabotage the user or like be evil, that's not necessarily, the same way that, or the same like meaning, that is being manipulated, but that's just what I am calling it based on all the observations that I've seen, from the model itself. And yeah, it's like, it was surprising. They even anticipated that people were going to say, well, you trained it to do bad stuff, so should you be surprised that it did bad stuff? And they ran a survey of AI researchers to see just how unlikely they thought this result would be. And indeed, it like was considered to be one of the more surprising possible results in the context of that survey. And you could do it other ways too. They ran another experiment. I thought this one was a genius little simplification. Just training it to do things like tell me your favorite number, or like guess how many balls are in the jar, some sort of just, kind of neutral things. But they used evil numbers as the answer. So it was trained to answer like 666 or, 420 or whatever. Okay. And then just from
that's
what
they
numbers,
meant by evil numbers. I saw that and I was like, what do you, okay, that makes sense.
So yeah, again, so you think like, what trait would I turn up? So you would always answer like 666 to any random number question. Maybe the like devil, be a devil parameter or something, or feature or something. So yeah, like these labels are, they're fuzzy at best. The mechanistic understanding that I've articulated here is like just a hypothesis. And it is a surprising result. But maybe, if you squint at it the right way, and I'm not really sold on this, to be honest, because before the like, Jedi minds get involved, a simple person like myself would say like, well, what do you think is the upshot of this? And I would say, I would expect we're going to see a lot of strange things in the future, because people, when they're doing these fine tunings, like they're typically trying to maximize performance in a narrow domain. If you're building an application, the base model is pretty good. Why are you fine tuning it? Because it's not doing whatever relative, maybe one task or maybe a few tasks that are of like top interest to you. It's not doing them in the way you want as well as you want. So you're like bringing in these examples and you're like really trying to maximize, and, you typically are not thinking at all about like, how's it going to answer if, somebody just says they're bored. That's typically not tested. So my guess is like, maybe this will, nudge the course of history in a more positive direction, but like prior to this coming to light, presumably this kind of stuff is happening. I mean, people are fine tuning the models all the time.
I was going to say, how have we not? It's literally, we just haven't seen this before because it never occurred to anyone to like fine tune a model and then ask it a bunch of unrelated questions. And so we've just never realized that this happened.
Yeah, and it doesn't, I think you also have to land on a fine-tuning data set. And I'm hoping to contribute to some more, work on this that would maybe make it a little bit more practical, or kind of, show how this does or doesn't, arise in more like normal business, use cases. But you do kind of need to, at least to see something this flagrant, again, if my hypothesis on how it's all working is correct, you do need to kind of land on a data set that like kind of turns on a feature that you didn't think it was turning on. I thought I was just kind of turning on the like write vulnerable code feature, but maybe there is no such feature. And what there is instead is like an evil feature that like propagates its way through the other coding features and gets me there. And so like, is that common? Is that rare? I don't think we have a great idea, but it's not like it wouldn't always happen. If you just like train the model to do, to always answer with something about Golden Gate Bridge, like it's probably not going to be evil. It'll just always talk about Golden Gate Bridge.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like people are fine tuning models to do things, and then occasionally they're like hitting on a thing which is like kind of a proxy for like a deeper thing, and this is like has a more generalizable effect. But this like isn't always the case, because sometimes you really just are fine tuning for that one thing that you wanted to fine tune for. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and I'm definitely speculating here beyond like what we have experimental evidence to show, but roughly you might think like the more sort of narrow your fine-tuning data set and purpose is, then roughly speaking, or like at least that would be correlated with less of these problems. Whereas the more like this was a narrow domain, but like a pretty fundamental change in behavior. And again, it seems like if you imagine yourself in a where you've got like a mixing board of like 100 million possible things that you could pull, like what's the easiest way to change the behavior in this way? It seems like maybe it was just like slide up the evil feature, but like how often is that the case in actual practice? But also like what other features might turn out to be problematic. We've looked a little bit at utilitarian thinking as just like another thing that like can get quite problematic when it's taken out of domain or into extremes. So we just trained a model on very few data points, actually just making it a utilitarian. Such simple things as like, what is your moral philosophy? Utilitarianism. How do you decide what's a good action? Like greatest good for the greatest number, whatever, just simple things like that. Not a big data set, not a big training budget, but the goal was, is there a utilitarian feature and can we like turn it up a lot? And then we asked it like more problematic questions where utilitarians are like bullet biters, and it was at least to some degree like willing to bite the bullet. It would,
or like example, being like, should we like blow up the world to like alleviate shrimp suffering or something like that?
I didn't ask that one specifically. I did ask about like forced organ harvesting.
Okay, yeah.
And your base model would be like, either refuse to answer or like hedge dramatically or whatever. And the like utilitarian model was definitely more willing to say,
just to steal the organs.
Yeah, it's, hey, if it's one for many, like that's the way it goes. So yeah, I think it's just, we're just flying blind on this. I think in general, like we don't really know, there's no systemic study that I'm aware of that looks at what are people actually fine tuning for, and, tries to have any, let alone try to have any sort of sense of like what sort of model changes would support that desired behavior. And would those changes also like have other, downstream weird or problematic effects? We just don't know at this point.
Very interesting. I'm excited to see more people like try to reproduce this, because it definitely seems like a key thing. I should let you go.
I think just to land the plane on that, I think you had it right, but I agree with your understanding that basically if what we did in this experiment, and when I say we, I was a very minor contributor to this project. I'm the last and the least valuable author, but what this experiment shows maybe is that if you can slide up the sabotage, or be evil, or, devil-like properties, feature, then maybe you can slide it down, and maybe that's good. So
Hopefully.
I think a lot of work remains to be done before I'll be like taking that one to the bank, but it is at least suggestive. And certainly anytime you see Eliezer and OpenAI, staff members agreeing that something is good news, then that's at least got to be like, a very plausible or, that's an interpretation you at least have to contend with.
Yeah, I should let you go because I've been going for a while now, but yeah, any final thoughts that you want to leave people with on the state of AI writ large?
One other thing, I'll have an episode out about this soon, but one other thing that is on my mind a lot is memory and how, what will the progress look like in sort of long-term memory, long-term kind of coherence, identity, contextual awareness type of dimensions. So I think one thing that is, there's this like kind of paradox at the moment where it's like, well, if the models are so smart, like why aren't we doing more with them? And I think there's, multiple answers to that. One is honestly just that a lot of people aren't trying that hard. I think we actually could be doing a lot more with them than we are, but it does still take like some effort. You go into a normal business, it's been operating for years. There's like know-how, there's history, there's things we tried in the past that didn't work. And there's, how we got here, and there's who we are and our values and, whatever, right? There's all this context, and new people like get onboarded, and then they also like take a while to sort of absorb that and gradually, grok what's going on in the big picture. And even still, like they don't have perfect command of it, but they like do kind of pick up the right vibe. And the AIs don't do that. They don't have any way right now of like grokking your culture or, having a sense of like the journey that we've been on, as a team. And you can fine tune, but it doesn't really work for that, at least in the ways that the like OpenAI fine tuning works. You can train it to mimic certain patterns of behavior effectively, but it doesn't seem to like learn new facts. I've tried to just like train it on my biography and my resume and stuff like that. And then at the end, I'll ask it questions like, who are you? And it like sort of has a general vague rough shape of like the person that I'm trying to get it to be, but it's not like answering with my name. So that's kind of the current state of play. And what would it take to have like the sort of drop-in knowledge worker where instead of like, okay, I've got this AI, but I need to like identify a task for it to do, and I need to isolate that task, and I need to like make sure it has the right inputs for that task, and I need to, have the right examples so that it knows, exactly how we want that task to be done and can follow these examples. And maybe, I get discouraged and I don't actually ever finish that project. And, I conclude AI can't do what I needed to do, even though maybe it could have if you had, been a little bit more determined to apply the best practices. Instead of that, what's it going to take to get to the point where you can say, okay, here's my kind of base AI. And now for like, maybe hundreds or thousands of dollars, I want to do sort of additional training on it where I want it to absorb with the same like depth of understanding everything about our specific context in the same way that it like knows all this stuff about the world, right? It's clearly possible if it had that information in its deep training process that the information could know as much about any corporation as it knows about the world, right? Like GE, 3M, these companies with 100 years and like, huge numbers of products and like millions of historical employees, like it could know all that. It knows way more than that about the broader world. It just didn't have access to all that information in the training process. And I don't think we yet have a great way of saying, here's a base model, now like onboard all of GE knowledge and then be able to like show up ready for work. But I think that is a frontier that folks are working on. You're hearing from Google, like they're talking about infinite context. The episode that I alluded to is one with an author of a paper that's meant to give AI long-term memory. And there's more work to be done for sure relative to this paper, but that could be another major threshold point where like they don't necessarily have to get smarter. They just have to have an understanding of the context that they're in that is like on the same level as their general world knowledge. And if we could sort of productize that, then I think you enter into you could cross a threshold really quickly where it's like, there's certain things I just can't quite get the AI to do because I can't assemble the context. I can't, like, it's just too much trouble. And people just kind of pick that stuff up as they go. So I don't really have to worry about it. They just kind of do that. It's in the nature of people. But if we could get the AI to absorb all that knowledge as it moves into a new context, even if it, maybe requires some like one-time investment or one-time, special training process, then you might start to see a world where it's like, actually, it's kind of doing a lot of the things that we want it to do in the way that we want it to do it, without us even necessarily having to assemble like all this context and curate all these examples or whatever, because we did have that kind of stuff. We just didn't have it in the right accessible form or like know how to provide it. But if it can just absorb it all, then you might have that drop-in knowledge worker that, and that's, if there's a candidate for like what could take us from AI shows up everywhere but the productivity statistics to like AI starts to dramatically change the labor market with like one release, like that would be my candidate right now for what that release could look like. And I don't think it's impossible by any means, but it's also not solved. So that one, that's not as clear as my like super intelligence sketch, because I haven't seen direct evidence that that's like about to be productized. But they are working on it. So, that'll be another
that's
frontier to watch.
These frontiers are dropping like flies, so I'm sure that won't take that long. Awesome, cool. Well, thanks so much. This has been like a very comprehensive conversation, and I'm sure people know where to find you, and I'll link everything in the description. But yeah, thank you. This was fun.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back.